Hello everybody, welcome back, or if you're new here, hi, hello, welcome. My name is Bash Harry and this is the Harry Knit, where, as you can probably tell, we do a lot of knitting content here, so subscribe if you are interested in that. I have been fasting the past week or so. If you don't know, I'm Muslim and it's Ramadan, so I've been fasting from like 5 a.m. up until 6:30 p.m. and my sleep schedule is like a roller coaster. I've been up since 3:30 this morning because I realize if I fall asleep after, then I just don't want to film or I don't want to do any work. I just want to sleep the whole day. I feel very lethargic. And I've been putting off this video for a while. I wanted to film this because I've got some thoughts and I thought it would be good if I filmed a video about my unpopular knitting opinions. I don't think they're unpopular, but they are a few opinions that I don't see a lot online, and I want to talk about it. I guess what started it was that there was a live chat that happened a few days ago, and I'm not going to talk about it because honestly I was off of my Instagram for a while. I was just really tired, but there were some points that were brought up in that live chat and some reactions or responses that I saw from people that I follow, and that made me think about my own knitting ethos and my own knitting opinions that might be unpopular. So I wanted to sit down, I wanted to knit a sweater that I've been knitting for a month already and just kind of talk about it. Obviously, this is a safe space, so feel free to share your opinions and your unpopular thoughts. But of course, try to be nice and civil. We're all civil here. But yeah, I think that's about it. The sweater that I'm making is the Dibiaski sweater by Monomash. It's already released. This is a test knit, but it's already released. I just have to do the ribbing portion, so I think I'm going to do that. And then I'll try to slowly finish off the sleeves. It's not that it is a long pattern, it's just that I haven't really found the time to knit because I've just been so lethargic the past week because of Ramadan. Disclaimer, I guess, but I don't think I need one. Obviously, these are my own opinions. If you disagree with them, that is completely fine. You know, we're all humans, we have our own opinions, but I would love to hear your thoughts on my opinions. I'd like to hear your thoughts on your own unpopular opinions if you have any. And yeah, I guess let's get started. I don't think I have a lot of spicy takes. I don't think so. But one that I've kind of realized over the course of starting a knitting channel, being more involved in the knitting community on Instagram, on Ravelry, that kind of, I wouldn't say irks me, but definitely has made me think quite a lot about knitting, is that there has been this discussion that knitting is very accessible for people. And I disagree with that. So I guess that's my first unpopular opinion, is that I don't think knitting is that accessible. Maybe it is in Western countries where more people are knitters. However, I live in Southeast Asia. I live in a country that doesn't really have a lot of fiber artists. And because of that, knitting can be very inaccessible if you do not have internet access to learn how to knit, the money, the income to purchase the supplies that can be very, very expensive. I'm serious, like knitting needles, good knitting needles can cost up to $20 here. It's ridiculous, but it's true. And even patterns, like most of them are in English, and not everyone here, where I'm from, is able to speak English or read English on that level. I think when we talk about how knitting is accessible to many people, it is very Western centric. We assume that everyone can, read these English patterns. We assume that it is easy for people to learn knitting And even though it has definitely been easier to get into over the past decade because of Instagram and YouTube, I think we still need to go further in helping other countries and other places with this art form, because it is an art form, and I'll talk a little bit more about that later. I think another thing that people don't recognize when it comes to knitting accessibility is, I've mentioned it before, language barriers. Here in Brunei, we talk predominantly in Malay, and so a lot of knitting patterns, I don't believe I've seen a knitting pattern that was like in a Malay language. If I'm wrong, please correct me. I'd love to be wrong in this. It has been in English, but even then, sometimes not everyone can read English as well. Another thing that I think the Western centric knitting community focuses on is that they always talk about indie designers or indie dyers. And I love indie yarns. I want to work with indie yarns hopefully in the future. I have a few that I've purchased here in Brunei that was like shipped, but as I said, it's not accessible for me. I live halfway across the world from a lot of people who do indie yarn. They just don't ship to my country because of the very high shipping prices, and I 100% understand why. It is really expensive. So unfortunately, us on this side of the world may not have the same access to indie yarns and helping out the small businesses simply because, you know, we're not able to. And going into that, speaking about yarn or like designers, I think people have to be more aware that yarn patterns can be very expensive for people who live in this area whose conversion rate or currency exchange rate is more expensive. So take, for example, the pound to Brunei dollar. The pound is, I think, I'm going to say 250. I could be wrong, I'm sorry. But for a Brunei dollar, the exchange rate is like 250 pounds. And you can see how expensive that is, or like vice versa. Whatever is, it's better for like the British side. It can be very expensive to purchase patterns, to purchase yarn because of the conversion rate. And so for me personally, being a knitter for 10 years or so and living in the UK for a while, I realized how accessible knitting was for when I was living there at the time. There was a knitting shop that was like right outside my accommodation. Which I wish I spent more time in. The ladies there were really nice, but you know, compared to that and how there's literally only 2 knitting shops here in my whole country compared to the UK's hundreds, I believe, it kind of goes to show how, you know, because there's not a lot of people here who are interested in knitting or like crafts, it has become quite inaccessible to get, you know, the supplies or tools needed. And so for me personally, it is really hard to ascribe to the notion that knitting is accessible. You know, I'm only thinking about this through a global view or perspective, but I'm sure many other people can say it from another space, whether it's inclusive of people with different abilities. But I don't think I want to talk about that simply because I don't have any experience with that. It's just purely from my view as somebody who lives in a different part of the world. But yeah, I think that's my first unpopular opinion. The second that I have, and I think this was inspired, not necessarily inspired, that's not the word, but it was because of what was said in the live chat. I think there was a mention of not being able to sell mediocre patterns or something like that. Or there's too many designs that are mediocre. I could be paraphrasing. This is what I found on somebody else's response on Instagram. So I have one unpopular opinion when it comes to mediocre knitting designs, and that is, while I don't believe there is such a thing as mediocre designs, I do believe that there is a thing as mediocre patterns. Let me explain. So I know how hard it is to design, grade, test knit, publish a pattern. It takes so much effort, so much skill, so much time and patience to make. And I will never say a design is mediocre, because it has taken a lot of work and it could take weeks to months to design. That being said, from a consumer's perspective, I have seen patterns that are just so hard to read. And that kind of disrupts the knitting process as a knitter, as a hobbyist or consumer. And so I think we've all seen a pattern which is just so hard to read or understand. Whether it's just hard to read or hard to understand, you know, these are things that I feel makes a pattern, a piece of PDF or whatever you use, to be mediocre, because it takes a lot of brain cells to understand. And I personally love knitting patterns that are more easier to comprehend and understand. Not necessarily having the abbreviations or links to how to do this, but simply how easy it is for the reader to understand and comprehend. And that takes a lot of time. That takes a lot of skill, I think. And that's why people hire tech editors to do their design work. But from my personal opinion, I think mediocre patterns, there are definitely those that I have seen that really make knitting unenjoyable for me, because I have to look at this pattern, try to figure out what the designer meant. And if I made a mistake, do I blame the designer or do I blame myself for not understanding how they wrote it? So for me personally, it is kind of like the customer is always right, even though that's not true at all. There are very oftentimes the consumer is wrong. But, you know, from a knitter's perspective, I think we need to be able to comprehend what we're trying to make with their designs, especially if it's a design that we paid for. I think when you pay for a product, you also want to pay for the ease to create it. The ribbing is taking much longer than I thought. Is that hair? No, it is a piece of paper. Another thing that I wanted to touch on, and I think a lot of people have this mindset as well, especially if you're a knitter and that you're around, I want to say, a younger demographic. And I guess that is this assumption that fiber arts isn't an art form. I fully believe that fiber arts should be considered an art form by more people. And I think perhaps the only reason why it's not is because of sexism. But like, because fiber arts like knitting, crafting, sewing, needlework has been considered a traditionally feminine hobby or tool or skill since long ago, more people see it more as not necessarily as an art form, but something of a hobby, as a fashion statement, if you want to call it that. And so I won't deny that a part of me had thought of this before when I was younger, because obviously I was younger. I didn't really know much. I thought, oh, well, I can make clothes, which of course is one of the reasons why I started knitting 10 years ago. But as I grow older and I kind of recognize that this is an art form unto itself, you know, being able to follow patterns, learning to follow up designs, recreating an artist's pattern or garment is just as valid of an art form. I took art and law back in uni and I really loved it. I really loved my lecturer and how she kind of explained art law and how art in itself should be considered an art form. And one of my projects or assessments for that time was how I wanted to talk about makeup and how makeup was an art form. and to dismantle the patriarchal view that makeup wasn't an art form, because I fully believe it is, just as much as I believe sewing and knitting is. Because it does take effort, it does take time, and there is a skill level to it. I think when we think about what is art, we have to dismantle the idea that there's only a rigid view of art, and that is only things that predominantly men are creating. Those in museums are predominantly created by men. Picasso, Salvador Dali, even Bob Ross, I would say, would be considered traditional male painters that have had a lot of fame and notoriety as artists because they were involved in this craft. But you don't see a lot of women painters, I'd say, getting as much notoriety. I think one that I can think about is Frida Kahlo. But moving on forward to that, who are the knitters that I would consider artists? Because I think designers are artists. I think people who can create beautiful artworks out of yarn are artists. I've seen a few on the runway even. You know, fashion is artwork. But I think the discussion of whether art or like fiber arts and knitting is considered an art form falls under the idea of, is fashion an art form? And even in the law, fashion, you can't trademark or patent designs, because fashion is considered, or clothes or garments are considered utilitarian and not an art piece. So keep that in mind. I think what society, the world that we live in today, does value art 100%, but it's only the art that they choose to value, instead of things or designs or forms like fiber arts that include knitting and crochet. Just my 2 cents. I know I'm blabbling. This is my background, so I obviously really love talking about art law and what counts as art and what counts under law, and how the law system doesn't necessarily mean what it means now, and I think it should change. But that is a whole other topic for a whole other day, with a whole other thesis that I haven't done in 3 years. Where was I going with this? The next unpopular opinion that I have is about the sweater curse. So the sweater curse is a belief that if you make something for your loved one, you're going to break up before it's done, and usually it's a sweater. I don't know if the sweater curse is real. I try not to believe it. That being said, I've never made my partner a sweater. At most it was a sock, and I'll be honest, I did not like making it for them. But that's because I'm a selfish knitter. But I think for me, the reason why some people believe in the sweater curse is because they have a partner that doesn't really appreciate the time and effort a sweater makes, like a sweater takes to make. So, you know, a sweater can take weeks to a month or even months to finish because of how tedious and how time consuming it is. Picking the yarn, picking the needles, picking the design that suits them. It takes a long time. Picking the right material too. Like, your partner may not know the difference between acrylic and merino, and you have to explain to them like, oh, this sweater that I made for you is 100% merino and has a little bit of nylon, so it's going to be sturdy, whereas they might not know the difference between that or an acrylic or a cotton. And so for me, it is more like a confirmation bias that your partner may not really value the work that you put in, and so it kind of feeds into that sweater curse. But that could just be my unpopular opinion. That could definitely just be like me projecting my own thoughts into it. But yeah, I think for me though, I don't intend on making my partner a sweater anytime soon. Well, I might, but that might be for future me to decide. As of now, I hope he's just happy with the socks, because I'll be honest, I didn't really like making socks for him, but I think that's just because I don't really like making socks in general. I should have made a vest or something, because I actually like making vests for people instead of socks. Speaking of that, going off from that tangent to another, I think another unpopular opinion of mine is that I think you should be more of a selfish knitter. I think you don't owe anyone gifts with your knits, especially when you're a knitter, especially when you make things out of yarn and needles, whether that's crochet or knitting or even needlework. A lot of people have the assumption that you're going to make them gifts with that, either a sweater or socks or hats, or you are selling it to them. However, I don't necessarily believe you need to. Of course, if you want to, go ahead. I've made plenty for many, many babies, but it's up to you whether or not you want to, knit this for that specific person. For me, I get a lot of messages about how much a sweater would cost or how much a baby hat would cost, and I would tell them it costs about this much, and they just say, it's too expensive, I can get it at Shein for X amount of money. I'm like, well, Shein, we all know what's wrong with Shein. We're not a Shein people in this household. But, I think that comparison does hurt because, if you just see how long it takes to knit, how long it takes to make a garment, it does emphasize how much some people may not appreciate your skill level, your art form, and what you enjoy out of it. I will definitely continue to make gifts for people that I love and care for, especially those with babies, because there are a lot of them coming out. But my point still stands that I fully believe that my cat is screaming. I fully believe that knitting it should be something that you enjoy for yourself and yourself first before you do it for other people. I'm sure that if I have kids in the future, that opinion might change, but I do not have kids now, so I'm gonna choose to ignore that. This video is going really, really long, and that's just because I'm a chatterbox that likes to go against the grain. Is it really the grain? Another thing that has been on my mind lately is the idea that you have to do a lot of things, or to know how to do a lot of things to be considered a better knitter. I have been knitting for 10 years. I started when I was like 14, when I was only making hats, and I was pretty good at it. I actually made my own pattern inspired by Darcy. I can't find the pattern anymore, but one thing that I have learned over the 10 years that I've been knitting and practicing my gauge, my swatching, my tension and all that things, and trying to be better at designing or making garments, is that you don't need to be better at things to be a better test knitter. Not test knitter. You don't need to be better at other things or at all the things to be a good knitter. I think we have this assumption that if you want to be a better test knitter, you've always got to level up. You got to know how to do this pattern or that pattern, do brioche or fisherman's rib. But I don't think that's the case, especially if those designs or stitches aren't something that you want to do. So for example, I still don't know how to do brioche or fisherman's rib. I don't know how to do that. I am really bad at that. But I still consider myself an intermediate or like advanced knitter because I've been knitting so long and reading patterns are easy for me. I would say that because of that, I consider myself an intermediate or advanced. I think my cat broke something. I can hear it. Unless you want to be better at a specific type of pattern or stitch or whatever, you don't really need to force yourself to learn if you're not going to enjoy the process. I will always do stockinette because it's the easiest and I think it's like the prettiest one to do. But that's because of my own personal opinion, really. Nothing more, nothing less. But if you are somebody who wants to start learning how to be a better knitter, You want to work on your attention. You want to work with projects that you know you're going to enjoy, and more importantly, get a lot of use out of. So I think that's my focus, really, when it comes to being a better knitter. But of course, that could be so different from somebody else. Another unpopular opinion I want to share, and this one was also from the group chat, or not the group chat, but the live chat that was happening a few days ago, and it touched upon test knitting or paying your test knitters. And I think this is like a very hot topic. I am a test knitter. I am the occasional test knitter person. It's a good way to kind of save up your money when you really just don't really want to spend any money on knitting, to be on patterns, to be honest. But there was the discussion of whether or not you should pay your test knitters and if you're exploiting them because you're really not paying them for anything, really. And to be honest, I have mixed opinions about this, mostly because my thought is quite nuanced, as every topic can be. It's not black and white, it's mostly just gray and a slightly darker shade of gray. But being paid as a test knitter is very hard to kind of navigate. I think bigger companies like yarn brands or bigger designers may be able to or should be able to test knit their patterns with test knitters. However, isn't that the role of a tech editor who's supposed to point out these things and, you know, relay this information to you? And the test knitter is there to make sure the pattern is, one, readable, there's no like big mistakes that they can catch. And it's, for me personally, an understanding that, you know, test knitters are there because they enjoy test knitting and they want to give back to the community in some way and help out the usually young indie designers with their projects and their patterns. A lot of people, I guess, do test knitting. They do give like yarn discounts, especially with the percentage they do. I know one test knit I did, they gave 20% off for the yarn. I wasn't going to do that because the yarn was already like 15 euros and conversion rate 20% off. It was still going to be very expensive. I was just going to use the yarn that I had. But I don't expect payment when it comes to being a test knitter because I just enjoy knitting as a hobby and I like helping the designer out. We have to remember that these designers are not like multi-million-dollar companies who can really afford to pay how many test knitters? 12, maybe 15, 6 at the most, maybe. So we have to recognize that these are just individuals who are usually just small micro businesses who don't really have that team to, you know, pay as much, if not them. And there's this idea that like, oh, you're gonna have this pattern going in for how long, forever on the internet, and get paid how much through passive income with that pattern. But those patterns may not give you money at all. For every successful pattern launch, there is another that didn't really have a great one, who didn't have a lot of people purchasing that pattern. And we have to understand that, especially as young designers or people who are just getting into the designer game, the pattern making game, they may not have that accessibility or the income really to put this like money, this monetary value into it. And not just that, like, it is expensive to design a pattern sometimes. It is purchasing that yarn that you like, making sure it fits with this garment, making sure it works, making sure everything is read. Some people, they pay for tech editors, and they can be very expensive depending on how intricate, that's the word I'm looking for, depending on how intricate the design is. You see, that's a lot of money to be added. So I don't necessarily think it's a bad thing that designers can't really afford to pay their test knitters. And I think test knitters, most of them don't come with that expectation that they will be paid. And I don't know about you, but if I was paid to be a test knitter, there would be so much pressure on me to have the design done on time, to have a lot of notes to give, all these kind of things that just doesn't feel comfortable for me. That doesn't make me feel good as a test knitter doing a hobby that I enjoy. An end date to finish is like the maximum. Giving my thoughts and opinions, I can do that. But getting paid to do it gives me a lot more pressure than I think is quite necessary. Because I am doing a test knit of it, and it's done already. It's already released. I'm doing this at my own pace because I didn't really have the time this month or last month to really finish it. And if I was paid for it, I would be so worried what I would have to do with that money. I don't know, man. It's just hard. But there's something about it, I guess, that really puts the pressure on designers to help when they might not be able to afford to. And take, for example, if I live in this country in Southeast Asia and a lot of test knitters are outside of my region, even if I did have like a discount or something, I wouldn't be able to give it to them because the shipping takes months or weeks, even a week at most. And it's just hard, really, to be able to navigate all of that. One thing I will say, though, is I think the least the designer can do is feature the test knitter. Like, be like, oh, wow, thank you for my test knitters. I mean, that's the least they could do as a thank you. Not necessarily in an exposure way, because I know a lot of people knit not because of exposure. They do it for the enjoyment. And it is nice to feel like you're giving back to the community. I think that is the least that a lot of test knitters ask. And even then, sometimes they don't want their photos to be posted or published. And that is completely fine. You live and you learn. And I guess that brings on to my last unpopular opinion, which I don't necessarily think is an unpopular opinion, but it's something that I, as a Malay person from halfway across the world, has noticed in the knitting community. Because I don't know if you noticed, I am Malay. This face will never look more than it is. I guess my final unpopular opinion isn't really an unpopular opinion, but it was something that I've been thinking about quite a bit, is that I really love how much the knitting community has changed drastically over the past, I want to say 3-4 years. Because I remember seeing all these things back in 2019, 2020 with Ravelry and what is going on. There's still some here on YouTube which I find absolutely fascinating, even though I don't ascribe to that idea. But one of the things that I've noticed is how compassionate the knitting community has been and how inclusive it has been as a space to open up to different facets of people. And that makes me really, really happy. Because at the time when I was starting out, there wasn't a lot of people who looked like me who started knitting. There weren't a lot of Malay people or Asians really who were knitters. And now I follow quite a few Asian knitters here on YouTube, and I really love it because, they're wearing pieces that they love, some inspired by their culture as well. And they're not from here, they're from halfway across the world, or they're from Australia or wherever. It feels really nice to be a part of a community that accepts you and understands your culture and your fears sometimes. I know that in the past, the knitting community, well, not the knitting community, but aspects of it has been highlighted with some not so great rhetorics and ideas, especially with everything that's going. But that being said, I always love how inclusive knitting is for people around the world and how much I really, really enjoy it. and I hope that the space, the community, becomes bigger and better for people as we grow older and as it grows, because I'm sure it's going to grow. And so I'm curious to see how further it will change in the next few years or so. I think that is about it from me. I'm quite a chatterbox during Ramadan, but I think that's because I've been awake for like, I want to say 6-7 hours now, so technically it is the morning, but for me it's like the afternoon, and I have not been eating or drinking since 5 a.m. and it's currently 9. And that's alright. I've been fasting since I was like 7, I want to say, so this doesn't really affect me as much. And honestly, I much prefer fasting here than in the UK, because I remember I'd have to wake up at 2 a.m. in the UK, and I wasn't able to eat until like 9:30 or 10, and it was very exhausting. And I was never gonna complain about fasting ever again. Especially because it was like during my study time, and it was crazy. It was intense, and I'd never do that again. But yeah. I hope this video has been a little helpful. It certainly was very cathartic for me to be able to talk about this. But yeah, I know that a lot of people may not have the same opinions, which is completely fine. If you have your own opinions, feel free to share it in the comments down below. It doesn't even need to be this intense, really. I'm just a very intense person, and I like to chat a lot about society. That's why I did law. And we are done. I think I did like 2 rows of rib, 2 rounds of rib. So I need to finish this. Hopefully by tonight I'm able to finish it, start on the sleeves, and finally be done, because this was due a while ago. Anyway, I think that's where the video is going to end. Thank you so much for watching. If you like this video, please do like, comment, and subscribe. My name is Bash Harry. This is the Harry Knit, and I will see you later. Okay, bye!